Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Janet Peace, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Business Strategy at C2ES, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and we're really happy that you could be with us today. Today's webinar, we're going to focus on Canadian action on climate change. I think there's a lot of folks who don't realize all the different things that are going on north of our border, and we're really happy to be bringing this webinar to you today. The Canadian government, whether it's the federal government or whether it's the provincial government, really considers climate change a top priority. And policymakers across the country have pledged to implement a number of policies and actions. And much of the action at the federal government is reflected in the PanCanadian framework on clean growth and climate change. And the goal of which is to help reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And to highlight these policies and really make it better known what's going on, C2ES has created a series of maps comparing key types of policies across Canadian provinces at the federal level, and we're comparing these with US states so you can get a little bit better idea of what's going on both north and south of the border. So our maps are covering climate action plans, greenhouse gas targets, carbon pricing. There's a lot of conversation in the US right now about carbon pricing, renewable energy standards. And if you look at this map, you may think it's a little odd that only the Western provinces have renewable energy standards, but I think it's important for a little context here that about 81% of Canada's electricity comes from non-emitting sources. They're very blessed with an abundance of hydro. We also have another map on clean vehicle policies, and you can find all these maps and on all of our policy maps on our website, C2ES.org. Today, though, we wanted to dive in a little deeper so that you can get more information than you can from a two-dimensional image, and so we've invited a few of our Canadian colleagues to give a little more detail on some of these policies. We're going to have an overview of what's going on with the federal Canadian framework on clean growth and climate. We're going to look in depth at one of the main pillars of that program, which is carbon pricing. And we'll learn a little bit more about what Quebec is doing to address climate change. And hopefully we'll get through all these. And hopefully we have enough time to actually get a few questions from the audience. I know there's always a lot of questions out there, so please feel free to send those to us. So we're going to start today with Vanessa Chang, who's going to give an overview of the Pan-Canadian framework. Vanessa is the Director of Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Coordination and Reporting at Pan-Canadian Framework Implementation Office. And then we're going to turn to Simon Tudever, who's a Senior Policy Advisor in the Carbon Pricing Division of Environment Canada. He's going to talk about, of course, Canadian carbon pricing initiatives. And then we have Onil Bergeron, who will give us an update on what's happening in Quebec. Oneill is the Strategic Advisor, Carbon Markets Division, Quebec's Ministry of Sustainable Development, Environment, and Fight Against Climate Change. So it's really great to have all of you on our webinar today. And then again, as I said, after we have all the presentations, then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. You'll notice in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's a box, a little chat box, and you can submit your questions there, and then we'll ask them of our speakers. So just real quick, before we get started, I suspect if you're tuning into a C2ES webinar, you probably know who we are. But for those of you for the first time, just real quick, we're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan think tank located just outside of DC, here in Arlington, Virginia. And we bring together diverse interests together to find practical and effective solutions to our climate challenge. And we really believe that it's vital for all of us, whether it's cities, states, provinces, business. We think it's really important that we all work together, really now more than ever, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deploy clean energy, and also prepare for the impacts of climate change that we really can't avoid. And we also agree with our Canadian colleagues it's going to take more than just one type of policy, carbon pricing, whether it's transportation, whether it's renewable energy. It's really going to take multiple policies for us to deal with our climate challenge. So with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker. Vanessa, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Janet. So I'm, as Janet mentioned, going to be providing an overview of Canada's National Climate Plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. So turning to the first slide, just to give you a bit of a context, our domestic plan was driven and inspired by the Paris Agreement and our ambitious NDC of 30% reduction emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. Flipping to the next slide, just to give you a bit of a context, Constitutionally, environment is one of the areas of shared jurisdiction between the federal governments and the provinces and territories, with all governments playing a key role in climate policy. And so, as a background to the development of our Pan-Canadian framework, post the Paris Climate Conference, the COP21, our Prime Minister and provincial and territorial premiers met in Vancouver and adopted what was called the Vancouver Declaration on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which outlined key principles and actually launched an in-depth domestic process to develop our plan to meet or exceed our 2030 target. After ratification of the Paris Agreement in 2016 and months of consultation and analysis, the Prime Minister and 11 of the premiers adopted the PCF in December of 2016. So flipping to the next slide, this is the framework. Our framework has 4 pillars. It's considered a landmark achievement, which included collective and individual commitments from federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and puts Canada on its path to meet the national 2030 target. It involves over 50 concrete measures under 4 key pillars of action: pricing carbon pollution, complementary mitigation actions across all sectors. So this includes things like regulations, investments, and all other measures to further drive down emissions. Adaptation, climate resilience. So these are targeted measures to help communities build resilience and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And for support for clean technology, innovation, jobs, these are policies and programs to support this growth and position Canada to transition to a clean economy, helping create new clean growth and employment opportunities. So I won't go into a lot of detail about the specific actions. I mean, my colleague Simon will go into more detail about the pricing carbon pollution, but other actions under the framework include regulating methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, accelerating the phase out of traditional coal-fired electricity generation by 2030, and limiting greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas-fired electricity generation, developing net zero energy-ready building codes to be adopted by 2030, and model retrofit codes for existing buildings by 2022, establishing mandatory labeling of building energy use for businesses and to provide businesses and consumers with information on energy performance, and setting new standards to improve the energy efficiency of appliances and equipment, increasing the stringency of emissions for light and heavy-duty vehicles, and taking steps to improve efficiency and support fuel switching in the rail, aviation, marine, and off sectors, as well as implementation of a $2 billion disaster mitigation adaptation fund to support the development of, to support community resilience and adaptation. And moving to the next slide. So not to go into great detail over all of our 50 initiatives, but to highlight one key one is the Low Carbon Economy Fund. This is a $2 billion fund to leverage investments in projects that will generate clean growth and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are 2 portions of this fund. The Leadership Fund is in collaboration with provinces, and it provides about a $1.4 billion to provinces and territories, the ones that have adopted the PCF, to help them deliver on our commitments to mitigate climate change, including those outlined in the framework. And the second portion is called the Challenge Fund of about $500 million to support projects that generate clean growth and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is open to a much broader range of applicants, including the private sector, nonprofit organizations, Indigenous communities, and municipalities. And moving to the next slide, and just to highlight that commitments under the PCF are underlined with historic investments that support green infrastructure, renewable energy, electric vehicle charging, investments in public transit infrastructure, investments in clean technology and investments. To support this, we've also launched what's called the Clean Growth Hub, which provides a one-window focal point for Canadian clean tech companies that are seeking federal programming and funding support. Next slide. In order to communicate on our investments, or so that Canadians can see some of the investments that the federal government and provincial, working with provinces and territories, have been making in climate action, we have a climate action map that is a snapshot of the climate actions across the country, including under all 4 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, clean technology, as well as infrastructure. And if you can see on this map, we have any of the black pins are public transit projects, the yellow pins are clean tech, green pins are mitigation, and blue pins are adaptation. And if you click on any of these pins, you can see more details on the project, including the proponents, a brief description of the project, the amount of funding supporting it. And moving to the next slide, it's really key in the implementation of our national plan that we have a collaborative approach between federal, provincial, and territorial governments, as well as with Indigenous peoples, business, and civil society. 2018 is essentially the second year of the implementation, and so we've been shifting our work from design and planning towards the delivery of programs and funding. Our progress made includes like key regulations, including those governing coal, natural fire, gas, electricity, implementation of funding programs, launch of new adaptation, climate resilience funding, and funding announcements in support of clean technology projects across the country. Under the PCF, one of the key commitments was also to report back to Canadians and First Ministers on the implementation of the framework, the progress that federal, provincial, and territorial governments have made. And so the second annual progress report was released in December. So this slide just provides additional information of where you can actually find the framework, as well as the annual progress reports I just mentioned. In addition, we have reporting requirements under the UNFCCC, showing progress towards our target, our 2030 target. But so the most recent emission projections are also provided at the bottom link. And that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. That was a quick overview because I know there's a lot going on, but we'll come back. I know I have a few questions, but at this point, let's turn it over to you, Simon. And why don't you talk about the specifics of carbon pricing, if you would?
Sure. Thanks very much. So as Vanessa mentioned, carbon pricing is one of the 4 pillars of our national climate plan, and it's kind of one of the key measures we're putting into place across the country to reduce emissions, but alongside kind of a whole host of other policies and measures that we've taken sort of to work in complementarity with pricing. So if we're on the slide that says PanCanadian Approach to Pricing Carbon Pollution, so this was announced by the federal government in October of 2016, and was based on kind of a number of principles that had kind of been discussed and agreed upon with many of the provinces and territories, namely that pricing should be a central part of the PanCanadian framework, our national climate plan, that pricing should be flexible and should recognize that many provinces had already taken action on pricing and have been pricing carbon pollution for some time. That pricing should be applied to a broad set of emission sources across the economy, and that it should come in kind of in a timely manner, and that prices should rise gradually and predictably over time. So based on those principles, this slide shows that we introduced, or the federal government introduced, what we sort of call the benchmark, in order to ensure that there was a price on carbon pollution all across Canada, but allowing some flexibility for provinces and territories to take the approach that makes the most sense for them. So this benchmark includes a number of elements that each provincial and territorial system has to meet. So just going through these, so timely introduction. So what that means is, all the systems should come into play at the same time. Originally, it was intended to start them up in 2018. There's been a bit of a delay, but they're all going to be coming into force in 2019. So common scope, the federal government kind of points to British Columbia as kind of a bit of a benchmark in terms of their carbon tax and the coverage they have across their economy, which is quite broad. So any provincial or territorial system in Canada has to kind of at least meet the coverage that that BC has under their carbon tax. Two systems, so any province or territory has the flexibility to implement either a direct price system, so such as a carbon tax as done in British Columbia, such as the system that they have in Alberta, which is a levy on fossil fuels combined with a performance-based system for large industry, or provinces and territories can choose a cap and trade system, such as exists in Quebec. Legislated increases in stringency. So we have a price schedule that kind of goes along with this pan-Canadian benchmark, which is $20 Canadian per ton of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, rising $10 per year until it reaches $50 per ton in 2022. And so each provincial or territorial system has to meet that kind of price trajectory. So if it's a direct price system, their price just has to meet at a minimum those price levels. If it's a cap and trade system, they have to have annual declining caps that achieve the reductions that would be achieved through a price set at the benchmark level, and we determine that through economic modeling. Federal backstop. So if any province or territory decides not to implement a system that meets these basic requirements, then the federal government has developed a federal pricing system that will be put in place in that jurisdiction. So some provinces and territories have requested the federal system to apply in their jurisdiction. Other provinces and territories have not implemented a system that meets the standards. Revenues remain in the jurisdiction of origin. So under the federal system, any proceeds that are collected are not kept by the federal government. They are reinvested in the economy of the province or territory. And 5-year review. So as I mentioned previously, we have this price trajectory that goes up to $50 per ton in 2022. What happens to it after that sort of remains to be seen still. And so there's a commitment to do a full review of carbon pricing by early 2022 to inform the path forward, which includes determining what that price trajectory will be beyond. And reporting, so there's a requirement for provinces and territories to report on the outcomes of their system, and the federal government will report on the federal system to our parliament under the legislation that we put forward to enable that. So the next slide has a map to give a bit of a picture of where things stand in terms of pricing systems across Canada. So the dark blue, which includes British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec, those are existing, long-standing, in some cases, pricing systems. They all meet all the federal requirements, and so those provincial systems will continue to operate as they've been operating. The kind of lightest color there, so kind of a grayish color, which includes the Northwest Territories, and on the East Coast, Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. Those are newly proposed in 2018 provincial and territorial systems that also meet the federal requirements. And so in those jurisdictions, the provincial or territorial pricing systems will take effect this year. The sort of medium colored blue, so that includes Yukon, Nunavut, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick. These are jurisdictions where the federal pricing system will apply in full. So Yukon and Nunavut, the two territories in the north, they both requested that the federal system apply there. Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick did not propose systems that met the federal requirements, and so the federal system will be imposed in those jurisdictions. And just to ensure maximum complexity, there's also these striped jurisdictions. So Saskatchewan, sort of in the middle of the country, and it's hard to see, but far on the east coast, Prince Edward Island is also in this striped category. These are systems where there will be a combination of the federal system and a provincial system. So in the case of Prince Edward Island, they requested that a provincial levy on fuels apply combined with a federal system for large industry. So that's what will happen there. In Saskatchewan, the government of Saskatchewan proposed a partial system for large industry. And so the federal system will, in effect, sort of fill in the gaps. There will be the federal charge on fuels combined with the provincial pricing system for large industry, which covers certain sectors, and a partial federal system for industry, which will cover the remaining sectors. So on the final slide, I'll just say a couple of words about what the federal pricing system is, kind of what its structure is. So this slide shows on the left-hand side, so I mean, essentially the system has two parts. There's a charge on fossil fuels, and there's a performance-based standard-based system for large industry, the output-based pricing system. So this slide shows on the left fuel producers and distributors. They will be the ones who will actually pay the fuel charge directly to the Government of Canada. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, in the upper rectangle, it shows, so fuel producers will deliver fuels with the fuel charge embedded to end users. So basically the fuel charge is not levied at the pump, but the expectation is that the fuel charge the cost is passed through to end users, to consumers. And then the bottom right-hand part shows, so facilities that meet certain criteria will be subject to the output-based pricing system. And so they will receive fuel from fuel producers without the fuel charge, and instead they will pay based on their actual emissions. And the amount they pay is based on a sector performance standard, which is, it's an emissions intensity standard. So it's emissions per unit of output, and it's based on, the individual facility's actual output and the relevant performance standard for the activity they undertake. And the intent of this system is to ensure there is a price signal on all emissions and on industrial emissions, but to attempt to kind of maintain the competitiveness of domestic industries, given the fact that we are putting a price on carbon pollution in Canada, but not all countries are doing the same, and we have many industries that compete in international markets. And so this output-based pricing system is intended to limit the impacts on certain industrial sectors that are more trade exposed and emission intensive. So that's kind of an overview of the federal system, and I'll turn it back to you folks.
Thanks, Simon. I think that was a really good introduction. I know there's a lot more detail behind all of this, but before we get to those details, let's turn it over to Oneill. If you could talk a little bit about what Quebec is doing and how you're approaching the climate challenge, that would be terrific.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Quebec's approach to fight climate change. In this short presentation, I will give a brief historical overview. I will also describe Quebec's integrated approach with an emphasis on the cap-and-trade system. I will show major results achieved to date and conclude on future work. Next slide, please. So Quebec has always been acting as a leader to tackle climate change. Quebec published its first climate change action plan in 2006, and in 2007, we implemented a levy on fossil fuels to finance the plan, which was one of the very first carbon pricing initiative in Canada and in North America. In 2007, Quebec also defined its 2012 emission reduction target by order of council. There are also two other emission reduction targets that were determined later on. So the 2020 target and the 2030 target were determined by order of council in 2009 and 2016, respectively. In 2008, Quebec made its first step towards a cap-and-trade system by joining the Western Climate Initiative to help design guidelines for the implementation of an efficient cap-and-trade program. And then in 2011, two major steps were achieved for the implementation of Quebec's cap-and-trade system. The first one was that the regulation was adopted, basically after that the enabling statute was modified in 2009. And the second step was that the WCI Inc., so Western Climate Initiative Inc., a non-profit corporation, was created to provide centralized administrative and technical support to all WCI partners, so that means that WCI Inc. provides the electronic registry, the auction platform, and financial services, and also market monitoring. In 2012, the second action plan came into force, and this plan was supposed to be financed by carbon market proceeds rather than the levy on fossil fuels. The same year, in 2012, the annual declining caps of the cap and trade systems were determined again by order of the Council for the period 2013 to 2020. And again, in 2 years ago, in 2017, caps were determined for the period 2020 to 2030.
Yep. It seems to think I exist, but then it says enter your password.
Okay, as part of the integrated approach, the cap and trade system started in
Do we have like a company password?
Started in 2013, covering only in.
O'Neill, I'm just going to interrupt. Somebody, one of our speakers, there's some background noise. If everybody who's not speaking, put themselves on mute, that'd be helpful. Thanks. Sorry, O'Neill.
No problem. So basically, the cap and trade system started in 2013, and at that time, it covered only the industrial sectors and electricity generation. And then in 2015, fuel distributors were also covered by the cap and trade system, which replaced the levy on fossil fuels. In 2013, California cap and trade system also started and linked with Quebec in 2014. So each partner operated their own system as a standalone system for 1 year before they linked to form only one carbon market. Last year, the WCI carbon market welcomed a third partner, Ontario, but Ontario off-boarded after its cap and trade regulation was repealed in July. So that was a bit of a challenge, but still we made it. And this year, the PanCan framework is now in force, and Quebec received last year the recognition by the federal government that its cap and trade system fulfills the PanCan framework requirement. So now moving to the next slide. This slide shows you basically the integrated approach for Quebec. So this approach has basically two pillars. The first pillar is the cap and trade system, which you can see on the left. So the cap and trade system has two objectives. The main objective of the system is to induce emission reduction. And this is because of the declining cap that guarantees that there are emission reductions for the covered sectors. The second objective, which is more of a collateral, I guess, objective, is to collect proceeds from auctioning allowances. And all proceeds are fully sent to the Green Fund, which serve to finance the second pillar of the integrated approach, which is all the complementary measures that comprise the 2013-2020 Climate Change Action Plan. So this plan has basically two components. One is to achieve emission reductions in targeted sectors, as in the transportation sector that we will see later on. And the other component is to implement adaptation measures. There are also a number of other policies that do not have climate change as their main objective, but offer complementary help, just as the energy policy or electrification of transport policy and so on. And there are also other financing means that are available, basically from the private sector and other level of government. Now moving on to the next slide. We'll now talk about the cap and trade system in itself, but first let's have a look at Quebec's emission profile. So you can see that Quebec has annual total emission of just below 80 million tons for the year 2016. So it has one of the lowest per capita emission at below 10 ton of carbon per person. And Quebec's emissions represents 11% of Canada's emission. And since 1990, emissions decreased while the population increased, and also the gross domestic product also increased. On the right-hand side, you can see that the electricity, there are basically almost no emissions from the electricity sector because almost all the electricity in Quebec is produced from renewable sources, so hydropower and wind and solar. And you can see that the two main sectors that produce emissions are transportation and industry. The only two sectors that are not directly covered by the cap-and-trade system are waste and the agricultural sector, but their fuel consumption is indirectly covered. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is a description of the cap-and-trade system in Quebec. So it covers 7 greenhouse gases. It has 4 types of participants. So first, the industry, the large emitters that emits more than 25,000 tons a year. The other type is the fuel distributors, any distributor distributing more than 200 liters per year. Starting this year, medium-sized facilities can can opt in the system. So any facilities emitting more than 10,000 tons can opt in the system. And the last type is the participants. So these are participants that they do not have a compliance obligation, but they are registered in the market for example, for trading. The cap-and-trade system has a price control mechanism, so it has a minimum price and a maximum price. So the minimum price at auction is defined in the regulation, and it's about 19 Canadian dollars in this year in 2019. The maximum price is set by the reserve price, and it's about 71 Canadian dollars this year in 2019. The cap-and-trade system is a flexible system, so the emitters have the flexibility to define their own purchase strategy. So basically, they can first reduce their emission, or if they want to buy allowances, they have flexibility to do so, because we have a 3-year compliance period and we have quarterly auctions. So there are basically 12 auctions per compliance period. So the emitters have flexibility there to acquire allowances when it's best for them. The other way for emitters to get allowances is through free allocation. So free allocation is given to emitters that are exposed to international competition, so as to avoid the carbon leakage. The system also has an offset component, and this is to help reduce compliance costs, since offset units are usually sold at a lower price than allowances. We currently have one partner, California. Our market is linked with them, and Nova Scotia is also one of our partners. Nova Scotia uses WCI Inc. services, but its market is not linked to ours. We also have a discussion with Mexico and Oregon and a few others that intend to implement their own systems. Next slide, please. So the second pillar of Quebec's integrated approach is all the measures that are comprised in the climate change action plan. As I said, there are 2 components to this plan. First one in emission reductions. Here's a list of a few major programs. If I go through quickly, there's one to help acquire a new electric vehicle. There's a zero emission vehicle standard. There's also a program to help finance pre-commercial technological innovation. And the last one is a program for energy efficiency for household businesses and large industry. The other component is for adaptation. So it helps basically the government at the municipal level to know what are their specific risks to climate change. In this case, there's a program called Coastal Resiliency that helps municipalities to know what are their coastal risk. And there's also Uranos, which is a consortium, research consortium that help build knowledge about climate change and its impact in Quebec. Okay, next slide. This slide, there's a few major results from our cap and trade system. We had 2 compliance periods to date, 2013-2014, and the second one, 2015 to 2017. In both cases, we had 100% compliance, so all emitters surrendered the needed amount of allowances. So that means that emitters accept the system and basically they play along, if I can say so. We also observe an emission reduction of about 4% since the system was implemented for the industrial sector. And for most facilities, they lowered their emission intensity. So they're taking action to reduce their emission. And as I said before, we observe a decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions and economic growth and population growth as well. So that's a big result. Also, we didn't observe any carbon leakage, so no facilities moved their production from Quebec to somewhere else. So there's a limited economic impact of the cap and trade system. We also have successful auctions. So we had one auction last week, and we had 5 standalone auctions and 18 joint auctions with California, and no technical problem. And this gave us over $2.8 billion in proceeds that are all reinvested in the climate change action plan. Last slide, please. So regarding future work, we will have to work on post-2020 climate change action plan. There are a few teams here that are working on that. Regarding specifically the cap and trade system, we still have post-2023 allocation rules to define. So that's a big work that is ahead of us for this year. And we're also looking forward to have future collaboration and partnerships with other jurisdictions. Thank you.
Wow, Oneill, that you really covered a lot of ground. I mean, you really have been doing this for a while, and certainly are to be commended for starting early and getting the cap and trade program off the ground. Very exciting. You know, this is a question for all of you guys. You know, and Quebec has certainly been doing a lot. You've seen from the maps that there's action all over the country. I'm curious, and maybe one or all of you could answer this. How have you talked to the public? What have you done to talk to the public and even to industry about all these different policies? Could anybody talk to me about, or kind of share with what that strategy, communicating with the public and the industry has been about all of this?
Maybe I can go first, talking about Quebec's experience.
Onil, that would be great.
As I said, we had the 100% compliance result, meaning that the industry accepts the system, and this is mostly because they were involved in the discussion very early on. Back when we first were writing the first regulation, the industry was involved. We kept discussing with them. We held a few public presentation, and we also had face-to-face meeting with the industry, so we can hear from them what are their specific challenges and what are their views on the system, and we can share also our view on that. So that's one thing for the industry sector. Basically, the message is they have to be involved early in the process. The other thing is for the public. The process in Quebec for adopting new regulation involves consultation, so that it's already embedded in the way we are doing things. We publish a draft regulation. People can comment on it, and we can incorporate some of those comments. And more specifically about the cap and trade system, we also held a few public forums so that everyone was invited, so that we can explain what we were about to do, and we also receive comments from the public. So that would be Quebec's experience.
Oh, excellent. And Simon, I'm sure you had a variety of conversations with industry about carbon pricing, including probably on the competitiveness implications.
Yeah, so we're still in the midst of that, actually. So there's certainly been a lot of consultation with the public and with industry in particular around pricing and around the climate plan more broadly. I mean, there was a very big kind of public engagement at the outset of the climate plan, and throughout kind of the development of the federal approach on pricing. We've published a number of, we sort of start with kind of some of the broad principles of an approach that we publish and get comment and feedback on, and then move on to kind of draft regulations. So we actually just in the late December, we published a whole set of draft regulations for the output-based pricing system for industry. Mm-hmm. The public comment period just closed a couple of weeks ago on that, but we've gotten hundreds of submissions from largely from industry, but from public as well. And we have a pretty intensive and extensive engagement process with industry. It's been going on for a little over a year. We have something like 30 or 40 individual working groups with individual industrial sectors, where we've worked very closely in determining and collecting their feedback and input and data to help set the specific emission intensity targets for each sector. So there's been a lot of fairly intensive engagement with industry throughout the development of the pricing system, and we're not fully there yet. So we published these draft regulations at the end of 2018, and our final regulations are targeted for the spring. We have this sort of funny system in place where the regulation has actually already gone into force, but the regulations will take effect retroactively. So the system has taken effect January 1st, but the final regulations will come in the spring.
Oh, very good. So we have a question from the audience here about the revenue collected. And the question is basically, Quebec, Onil mentioned this techno-climate investment in pre-commercial technology innovation. But the question is really aimed at the federal dollars collected. Is any of it used for carbon reduction measures like technology deployment, whether it's carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or perhaps electric vehicle infrastructure?
Sure. So I can explain the approach that we've taken for the proceeds. So essentially, there's a bit of a two-track approach. For the provinces and territories that have requested the federal system be implemented, so that includes the territories of Nunavut and Yukon, all the proceeds collected under the federal system will go directly back to the territorial government. So we'll just give them a lump sum, and they can do whatever they choose with it. For the other provinces that have not committed to pricing and where the federal system is being imposed, so that includes Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick. In those cases, the federal government will be returning the proceeds directly to Canadians in those jurisdictions. And so what's been announced so far is the vast majority, about 90% of the proceeds from the fuel charge will be returned directly to individuals and households in the form of climate action incentive payments. So they're lump sum payments based on household size. It's a sort of the same payment for everyone essentially, although it's based on the proceeds collected in that particular jurisdiction. So because some provinces have a bit different fuel mix, the expected costs are different in the jurisdictions, and so that influences the amount that people will get back. And then there's also proceeds are being earmarked to support other sectors that will be affected by pricing. So there will be proceeds, there will be programming for small and medium-sized businesses, municipalities, schools, hospitals, Indigenous communities, and others. The details of those programs haven't been finalized yet, so I don't have more detail on what that programming will look like, but there will be some funding earmarked for them to help with taking climate action and various kinds of investments. And then there's still the proceeds from the output-based pricing system for industry, which again hasn't been finalized how that will be spent specifically, and we have a bit more time because we won't actually collect any proceeds until 2020 after the first compliance year. But the government is committed to returning that, I think likely to the affected sectors to help with additional emission reductions.
Oh, very good. And this next question, I think it's probably more for Vanessa, but anybody can jump in. Transportation is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada and here in the U.S. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the federal and provincial efforts to reduce emissions in this sector, and be particularly on the heavy-duty vehicle. And a question from the audience is, has the U.S. rollback of the EPA vehicle standards had any impact? So Vanessa, if you could start that one off, that'd be great.
Thanks, Janet. There, of course, are a lot of federal and provincial and territorial actions in this area. So I can highlight a couple of the really key ones. The provinces and territories have been in discussion with the federal government on the development of the Clean Fuel Standard, which aims to reduce emissions by 30 megatons of CO2 by 2030. So that would be the equivalent of taking 7 million cars off the road for us. As well, in 2019, as part of our new zero-emission vehicle strategy, we have set new targets for sales of zero-emission vehicles in Canada, goals of 10% of light-duty vehicle sales by 2025, 30% by 2030, and 100% by 2040. I'd like to just mention that also British Columbia has recently also set targets for their zero vehicle emission strategy as well. There's also a deployment of electric and alternative fuel charging infrastructure. So we've already invested more than $180 million to support this, in addition to a lot of actions undertaken by provincial and territorial governments. And we've also, for support for public infrastructure, we have finalized agreements with the provinces and territories under our Investing in Canada infrastructure program. So that's going to allocate $20.1 billion in funding to support public infrastructure across the country. In terms of the U.S. rollback, Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, but I can always consult with my colleagues who do and get back to you.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is hard to know exactly what the result is, and it's probably a little too soon to tell. But I appreciate the question from the audience. So keep sending those. I think that just shows a level of interest in what's going on up there. Another question that's been submitted is, infrastructure. Infrastructure is a big focus of conversation in the U.S. Congress, and everybody's talking about, well, so when are we going to have a big infrastructure bill? And so this question from the audience is, could the speaker say something about the Infrastructure Canada, the climate lens, perhaps? And I'm not exactly sure what that is. I don't know if that's a program, but I'm sure infrastructure is as much focus north of the border as it is to the south here.
It's Vanessa again. So for this, yes, we have a substantial, to really support the implementation of the Pan-Canadian framework, we are investing a lot in infrastructure. And what is meant by the climate lens is that for the infrastructure that's being supported by the Green Infrastructure Fund, the Green Infrastructure funding, that the climate lens is and forgive me, sorry, I don't have a lot of the details on this, but it's basically the methodology developed to examine projects being brought forward for their capacity to produce GHG emission reductions. So we have a lot of technical experts here in the department who have applied this methodology as a way of evaluating the cost per ton reductions and the impacts that projects that are being brought forward for funding under this program would have.
Oh, that makes sense. Very good. Thank you very much. Oneill, just so you don't think you're being left out of this conversation, I want to ask you about that linkage to California. And that was a big deal when it was announced. It's very exciting. I'm just wondering if you have anything to share about what have been the benefits of linking to California versus just doing it on your own? And then the next question is maybe back to Vanessa or to Simon about it. How about any more linkage within the province? So Oneill, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks for the question. As we saw in my presentation, electricity in Quebec is mostly or almost entirely produced from renewable sources. Mm-hmm. So there's basically no potential for emission reduction on that sector. So it's kind of the first step towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions has already been made in Quebec. So the next steps will all be measures that will be more costly. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the Quebec economy is quite small as compared to the whole North America. So the system would not have been sustainable in itself if it was applied only in Quebec. We needed a partner so that we can have a larger pool of emission reduction available for our entities. So we had to link with a partner, and California was a great partner to do that because they are also at the forefront of those measures regarding climate change. So by having such a partner, we were able to keep the allowance price quite low, which would not have been the case if Quebec has been acting by itself.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. The larger markets, the cheaper the cost of those allowances. I'm glad that that's playing out. What about linkage between you said you noted Nova Scotia on your list of potential partners, and maybe this is a question to Vanessa. Have you heard conversations about linking Alberta to Quebec or to Nova Scotia or to British Columbia? I mean, what about other linkages within the country?
So it's Simon here.
Great.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess what I would say is the federal approach for this is meant to kind of provide a fair bit of flexibility for the provinces and territories. So, I mean, if there is interest among various jurisdictions in linking up their systems, I mean, I think as long as it still kind of meets the overall requirements of the federal system, there would be no issue with that. I mean, I think in some cases it would probably make a lot of sense. I mean, one way this you could sort of think about, so the federal system will be implemented in a number of jurisdictions, and in the output-based pricing system part of that, there is a kind of credit market that's created, because for any individual facility, they have the potential of generating credits if their emission intensity is lower than the sectoral standard. And so, and that credit market kind of exists across all of the jurisdictions subject to the federal system. So there is, in a sense, kind of a market in those credits that will be created across a number of jurisdictions. Under the federal system, we're also, as a compliance option for the industrial system, we're also recognizing certain offset credits under different provincial systems that currently exist. And so there is an opportunity for kind of linkage in that sense. So there are, I guess there are a number of ways that kind of these linkages can happen. But yeah, at this point, kind of the only real formal linkage is, you know, as Oneill pointed out, is Quebec's linkage externally with California, and Nova Scotia's cap and trade system, yeah, is an unlinked system at this point.
Oh, terrific. You know, your answer, Simon, actually takes me to another question from the audience. And the question here is about offsets. And I take your point about offsets being kind of a soft way to link systems. But this question asks, what about offsets in other countries? Because they can help support action in developing countries, and especially help, you know, very poor in some of these developing countries, as long as they're reducing emissions. So has there been any conversation about offsets from outside of Canada?
Hi, this is Vanessa. Well, yes, I mean, that's definitely one effective way of or an action that can take. Canada hasn't determined yet whether we would be purchasing any kind of internationally traded mitigation at this point. I think if you are from the last from COP24, the rule book and Article 6 that are related to the international mitigation markets, they did make some progress, but there wasn't a concluding agreement at that time yet. So I think for this upcoming year, work will continue on in that area, and negotiations will continue. And you know, Canada, we expect to be making some decisions on that point. But this is a federal. I understand, like the provinces and territories also will be taking a different approach to this, and I think Oneill may be able to speak more about that.
Oneill?
Well, from Quebec perspective, we already have offsets from outside of Canada, since we are linked with California. And California has well, they accept offset projects from all over the United States. So that's one thing. The other thing, if we're talking about offsets from outside of our system, well, there's a lot of challenges, and I'm not an expert on that matter, but when we talk about the cap and trade system, the environmental integrity is very important. So that's why we have specific protocols regarding offset credits. So that would be the one thing that we want to make sure. We would like to make sure that is the level of stringency or environmental integrity is as high as the one that we have in our own system. But other than that, I'm not aware of more detail regarding interactions with other countries on that matter.
Well, you mentioned you were connected to Mexico. Has anything developed there where you're getting kind of reductions from Mexico? Or is that just too early to tell?
Well, we are involved in with Mexico. We have discussions with them. They want to implement their own system, so we provide the technical expertise to help them define and implement their system. But they don't have a system yet, so we're not linked with them as of now. But that could be something that we would consider later on, for sure.
Oh, very good. Hey, when you think about some of the most challenging sectors to really get emission reductions from, I think people in this space tend to really think about the industrial sector. And I'm just wondering, like cement or manufacturing, chemicals, and I'm not sure who this question would go to. It could be you, Oneill, or it could be you, Vanessa. I mean, have there been any specific kinds of policies to address emissions from the industrial sector specifically? I mean, I know carbon capture and storage is one of those ways that those emissions could be addressed, and that was a question from our audience. So, I mean, is there anything specific directed at the industrial sector, Vanessa?
Well, for us, I think what immediately comes to my mind is our efforts to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. That's one of the tiers we have.
Yeah, I mean, Simon, I'll just jump in. I mean, most of those sectors are covered under our pricing system. So pricing is sort of a key mechanism. We're also, I mean, this is more broadly under our climate plan, but there is a clean fuel standard that's being developed, kind of in phases at this point. The first phase is targeting transportation, so liquid fuels, but there is sort of a longer term plan to look at potentially gaseous fuels as well, so fuels that would be supplied to industrial sectors. There's also, I think there's a variety of energy efficiency type programming through our Department of Natural Resources focused on improving industrial energy efficiency by implementing kind of internationally recognized systems for energy management. So we have a number of kind of softer support mechanisms to improve efficiency over time. I guess at this point, at least federally, kind of the main policy driving industrial reductions would be pricing.
Very good. I mean, industrial sector always comes to my mind. The transportation, of course, is another one that's challenging. And you just mentioned the low carbon fuel standard. And I know earlier on there was conversation about electric vehicles. What about the oil sands? I have a question here. How will Canada's GHG reduction program affect production of the oil sands? Is there any impact on them?
Well, as I mentioned before, we are aiming to cut our methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by 40 to 45%. And so our efforts there are also targeted towards helping companies find cleaner ways to run their operations as well.
And I mean, again, so pricing will be a significant mechanism for achieving reductions in that sector. At this point, I mean, as you know, the vast majority of the oil and gas sector is located in Alberta, and Alberta has its own provincial pricing system in place, which does apply to upstream producers of oil sands and more broadly the oil and gas sector. Alberta has a number of kind of policies and regulations they've implemented. Obviously, they're more the experts on that than I would be, but they've implemented an overall cap on emissions from the oil sands, as well as kind of their overall pricing. And then, where other oil and gas operations exist. So it's mostly the western provinces. Alberta, British Columbia covers through its carbon tax emissions from its oil and gas sector, and the federal system will be put in place in Saskatchewan, where there's also a significant oil and gas sector. So broadly across most of those provinces, a lot of the sector will end up being covered under some form of carbon pricing.
Thanks, Simon. That was a great answer. You know, I know that Alberta is poised for a new election, and when elections happen, things change. So Ontario elected a new government last year, and they released a new climate plan. And so my question is to Vanessa: has that had any influence on the Pan-Canadian framework? Because that's the backstop that all provinces have to meet. So, I mean, has it had any influence, this change from Ontario?
Well, we've been working with Ontario, and it has the province has indicated that it intends on remaining a part of the Pan-Canadian framework, and they were actually an active contributor to our progress reports, like the progress reports I mentioned earlier that relate to federal, provincial, territorial action. They did release a climate action plan in 2018 that sets new GHG reduction targets for the province, and we are waiting to see further details on how they plan to meet their reduction targets. And overall, because our GHG emissions reduction goal is a national goal, the 30% of 2005 levels, we are still remain on the path to meeting that.
I guess I would just jump in and add too. The approach for pricing is that so when I outlined earlier the kind of where the federal system will apply and where the provincial systems will apply, that was based on an assessment that we did in mid-2018 of all of the plans for each province and territory for their carbon pollution pricing systems. And that will be an annual process that we do. So we will look every year at what each province and territory is doing in situations where there's a provincial or territorial system in place, to make sure that it's still meeting the basic requirements of the federal Pan-Canadian approach. So if there are any changes in a provincial system, we will look at that and we'll see if the province still meets the requirements, and if not, then the federal system will be put in place. Okay,
and Simon, along those lines, there's another question here about the how to set the price, and the question goes back to, well, you know, if you have a province that you know the politics change, and they go in and they decide to have a new climate plan, maybe their price that they select is less than. Well, you mentioned British Columbia as a base case, but I also noticed that like Newfoundland had a $20 per ton charge. So how do you decide on what the charge is, and how do you decide whether it's equivalent or not, if you have to do a federal backstop?
Right. So I mean, it would be part of this kind of annual assessment that we do, where we look at all the details of the system. So what happened last year was we asked all provinces and territories to submit kind of fairly significant sort of broad details of either the system that already existed or what they were proposing, and we did kind of a piece by piece comparison against the overall benchmark requirements. So I mean, as I said, we will continue to do that on an annual basis, so I mean, you know, the benchmark is designed to allow a fair bit of flexibility. So we do this assessment, but there is a recognition that you know, a provincial government should have some flexibility to determine kind of what makes the most sense for its circumstances. So when we look at the price level, which I guess was your question, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, if it's a price-based system, so if the system includes some sort of fuel charge or levy, then the requirement would be that it would meet the benchmark price trajectory that we have. So $20 this year, $30 next year, $40, et cetera. And if it's a cap and trade system, then we work with the province to do some economic modeling to ensure that the caps they have decline on an annual basis, and achieve the reductions that would be expected to get from from the direct price if it was imposed in that way.
Okay, great. So it's not just the price, it's the totality of the system that's in comparison, right?
Right. Yeah. Sorry. So there are a number of sort of several kind of criteria that we look at. So there's the price level. There's kind of the coverage level. So as I mentioned before, the ensuring that there's sort of broad coverage across the economy, that there aren't sort of large gaps in what's being covered. So it's those kinds of, we sort of look broadly at different elements of the system as a whole and ensure that it meets those kinds of requirements.
Oh, good. Okay. And there's also another question here, and I'm not sure who it goes to. Probably you, Vanessa. But it has to do with when you're thinking about the programs that you want to put into place by sector. So not just the pricing mechanism, but let's say you want to focus on vehicles. Have you talked to the different, and I think, Simon talked a little bit about this in terms of the outreach to sectors, but have you talked to the different sectors about which technologies exist, when they may be available, just to ensure that competitive impacts aren't going to really hinder that industry?
Yeah, in terms of like the regulatory approach, it tends to be technology neutral, but mindful of the competitiveness impact. So that's why when regulations are being developed, we do it in a staged manner where there's a lot of consultations with industry. There are a lot of meetings inviting their input into draft regulations before they are finalized, in order that we're able to consider the competitiveness impacts. There is also a working group also to talk about the cumulative impacts on a number of regulations, also invited with stakeholders and other interested parties to come in and discuss this with the federal government.
Okay, maybe I'll just add sort of the federal context here. Like, at Environment and Climate Change Canada here, we are kind of the overall leads on climate change policy, but as I think your question alludes to, there's a lot of other kinds of areas of expertise that need to be brought in, and so we work really closely with a lot of our partners across the federal government here. So we have a Department of Transport that is the expert on the transportation sector and has a lot of interaction with the transportation industry. Our Natural Resources Department has a lot of interaction with a whole swath of different industries. So we're working pretty closely with them, and they have a lot of connections with the different industrial sectors, and I think really understand the technological potential a lot more. And so the kind of regulatory and policy development process is really much more of a collaborative one, where we are sort of constantly being informed by these discussions and interactions with industry and kind of what the technical potential is. Great.
And kind of related to the process that you just talked about, there's a question from the audience. Can you give an update on the status of the federal government protocol development in the output-based pricing system?
Sure. So I think I explained a little bit of it. I don't know if there's a lot more to say, but essentially we publish draft regulations for the output-based pricing system. So I mean, those are available on our website. If anyone's interested, you can search and find it. Those were published in late December, and consultation is kind of still ongoing. So we just received a lot of comment on those draft regulations. We're going through those comments now. We're in the process of working with our Department of Justice in drafting the regulations, so the final regulations that'll come out in the spring. But as I mentioned, because of this, just because of sort of the way the timing of this has all worked, the output-based pricing system has already taken effect as of January 1st. in the provinces where it's in effect. And so we actually published kind of several preliminary regulations earlier in the fall, which outlined certain requirements for facilities subject to the OBPS. So it outlined who specifically is required to register. So those facilities have registered in the system, and it outlined kind of what a lot of the record keeping and quantification requirements are. So the kinds of things that the facilities have to start tracking now. So their emissions and their production level and kind of the specific methodologies for doing that. So those were all laid out in regulations in the fall. So the system is in effect, but kind of the final regulations that lay out all of the details around kind of the compliance obligations and all that those kinds of things that will come after the first compliance period. So in 2020, those are expected to be published in the spring.
So I'm taking it that you already know who's eligible or who's a recognized unit within the output-based pricing system, right?
So there's sort of, I mean, similarly to what Onil was describing in Quebec, there's kind of two classes. So there are mandatory covered facilities, which are any facilities that emit more than 50,000 tons of greenhouse gases. And then there's the opportunity for smaller facilities to opt in. At this point, that's above 10,000 tons of GHGs. And so we're still finalizing kind of the specific details around the opt-in. So we published also a draft policy around that at the end of December, and we're also getting comments from industry on the details of that opt-in policy. So that is still something a little bit in flux as to the specific scope of whether for allowing smaller facilities in. But in terms of the mandatory coverage, that is set, and those facilities have already registered in the system.
That's a good answer. I have a couple more questions that people have sent in. Basically, recognizing that there's a lot of complications. There's a lot of differences between programs. And so Oneill, this probably is best for you, and because you've already done it. The question is, how did Quebec navigate, differences between targets, the monitoring, reporting requirements between California and Ontario? Between California and Quebec, or maybe they were all the same. How did you go about making sure that you had enough consistency so that environmental quality that you mentioned as a primary goal is achieved?
Well, first, all the work that came out of the WCI collaboration, they put a lot of bases there that help to have harmonized regulation and systems that are compatible. So that's the basis for the being able to have a linked system. Other than that, specifically regarding California, it was the case also with Ontario when we were engaged with them for their cap and trade system. There was a lot of back and forth discussion. We have several working group that then we call California every week. So we are in constant communication. So we know we can see ahead of time what would be any improvement to the existing regulation, or if there are any changes that we can foresee, how we can harmonize that to make sure that the environmental integrity is still there. So that's an ongoing discussion, and that requires a consistent effort.
Great.
So that's how I would summarize it.
Yeah. So keeping in constant communication and early efforts with WCI were really important, and I can see where that's true. Okay, we're getting kind of close to the hour, and there's just a couple more questions, and one we really haven't tackled. We've been talking about all the different mitigation strategies across Canada and within the provinces, but really the impacts associated with climate change are probably, there's no doubt, they are more pronounced towards the north than they are towards the south. So Canada is really at the forefront of our changing climate. So maybe one or all could talk about what steps are being taken to help communities build resilience.
Maybe I could start. So yes, we are undertaking under the framework, which is a lot of actions to support community resilience, and building resilience to changing climate is one of the key pillars. I think one of our major initiatives is called the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, which is working towards implementing a database that's accessible, so that to support communities and Canadians in adaptation decision making. And so this is a collaboration with across the country with our existing regional climate organizations, including in the north, in order to provide people with timely and easily understood information on the changing climate. We also are working on infrastructure codes and standards. There's work in the health area for on sort of infectious diseases and climate-driven spread of infectious diseases, reduce air quality. We have specific support for the particularly vulnerable regions, the coastal, the northern, and Indigenous people. And we also have a $2 billion disaster mitigation adaptation fund to support large-scale infrastructure projects to build climate resilience. There's also a lot of actions that are undertaken in provinces and territories as well, individually, beyond this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do that actually reduce emissions and improve your resilience. And you mentioned energy efficiency, and it's very cool that you have a fund for emergencies. I love that. Oneill, is climate resilience an important topic there in Quebec?
Sure, it is. As I mentioned in my presentation, our climate change action plan has two components to it, and the second one is about climate adaptation. Then we have this research consortium that I just gave one example about coastal resiliency, but there are other program of studies for up north in Quebec for smaller communities that, for example, that have issues regarding permafrost, permanently frozen soil, and that can affect their infrastructure. So there are studies regarding these kinds of issues, and I don't know the specifics. I don't have all the details in front of me, but this part of adaptation is a major part of our action plan, where we want to have a better knowledge about what could be the impact of climate change, and so we are able right away or in advance, we are able to put in place measure or help those communities before the impact is too before there's too big of an impact for them to be able to continue to live in their own way.
Yeah. I know there's been several studies that have looked at what's the value of resilience, what's the value of investing in resilience. And I recall a study a few years ago that said, for every dollar that you invest, it's $4 in benefit that you get from investing ahead of time. And more recently, studies have said, you invest $1, it's $6 of benefit, or $11 of benefit for every dollar you invest. So I think, Oneill, as you said, is investing now to avoid those really large impacts in the future makes a ton of sense to me. Well, I think we've exhausted our audience questions, and I hope we haven't exhausted you guys, Vanessa, Simon, and Oneill. I know we've been peppering you with questions for the last hour and a half, and I know I can speak for all my colleagues here at C2ES. We very much appreciate you taking the time to talk about what's going on in Canada, and I know we've only barely tipped the iceberg, because I know there's so much more going on, but what, we wanted to cover as much as we could in an hour and a half, and I think we've been very successful because of the three of you going through this in such detail with us. So thank you all again, and I invite our audience to come to our C2ES website, check out our maps, let us know what you think, and we'll be watching what you do up north, and hopefully you can share some of your lessons with our policymakers in the U.S. as our different states and cities and our federal government moves forward. So thanks again, you guys.
Thank you, Janet.
Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.